I want you to picture something for a second. Just imagine a magazine cover.
Okay.
Specifically, the 1983 cover of the UNESCO International Social Science Journal. Right in the center, there's this illustration. But it is not a modern scientific diagram.
No, not at all.
It's actually an ancient Chinese silk painting. It was discovered in the Astana tombs in Turpan, dating all the way back to the 6th or 7th century. And it depicts two deities. They have human upper bodies, but their lower halves are, well, they're these long snake-like tails that are tightly intertwined.
And it's an incredibly striking visual, mostly because it looks exactly like the double helix structure of a DNA molecule.
Right, exactly.
You look at it and you just see these ancient mythical figures essentially mapping out the blueprint of life centuries before modern science even existed.
And, if you look closely at those intertwined tales, you aren't just seeing a quirky myth, you are looking at a highly encoded historical memory. So our mission for this deep dive into the source materials is to look past the fantastical veneer of Chinese creation stories.
Yeah, to uncover what they really are.
Exactly. We want to see the blueprint of humanity's brutal, messy transition from ancient matriarchal survival to the rigid structures of patriarchal empires. Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand those DNA-like deities, we actually have to start with how the Chinese mythological universe physically began.
Which is a wild story on its own.
It is. And surprisingly, the myth most people know about the creation of the cosmos isn't actually the oldest one in the culture.
Oh, far from it. If we look at the physical creation of the universe in Chinese myth, the most popular starting point is the state of Hundun.
Hundun, which translates to, chaos, right?
Right. You can think of Hundun as the state of absolute, undifferentiated chaos. It's often described as a massive, opaque, cosmic egg. And the myth says that inside this egg, a giant named Pangu slept and grew for 18,000 years.
Wow, 18,000 years just sleeping in an egg?
Yep. Then he wakes up, finds himself trapped in the dark, and basically slashes the egg open. The light, clear parts of the chaos float up to become the sky, the heavens, and the heavy, murky parts sink down to become the earth.
And just to make sure they don't crash back together and crush him, Pangu stands between them. He's physically pushing heaven up and stomping the earth down for another 18,000 years.
He literally acts as the pillar of the universe until the sky and earth are 90,000 leagues apart. At that point, exhausted from all that cosmic labor, Pangu dies.
But his death is actually the mechanism that generates the world we know.
Exactly. It's the classic corpse transforming into the universe trope. His breath becomes the wind and clouds, his left eye becomes the sun, his right eye the moon.
His blood turns into the rivers.
Yeah, his blood is the rivers.
And my personal favorite, rather grotesquely, the fleas living on his giant body fall off into the wind and become the animals of the earth.
It's a very vivid image.
It really is. But here is the wild part. You would think a story this foundational is ancient, but Pangu is actually a latecomer to the mythological scene.
He really is. He doesn't appear in the written text until the Three Kingdoms era. That is roughly around the 3rd century CE, so only about 1,800 years ago.
Which is fascinating because that was an era of massive political fragmentation and civil war in China.
Right. Scholars believe the intellectuals of that time desperately needed a unified grand narrative of physical creation to sort of bind the fractured culture together.
So where did they get Pangu?
Well, the current academic consensus suggests he evolved from the folklore of southern ethnic tribes, specifically a myth about a creature named Panhu.
And Panhu wasn't a giant at all.
No, Panhu was a magical, 5-colored dog.
A dog.
Yeah, a dog who helped a king win a war and ended up marrying a princess. As the central plains of China culturally absorbed these southern tribes, the myth of the magical dog Panhu was absorbed too. It gradually shifted and elevated over centuries until he was transformed into the universe-creating giant, Pangu.
Hold on, I'm trying to square this. Wait, if Pangu is a relatively recent addition, and the fleas on his dying body supposedly became the animals in humanity,
Yeah.
why do we have this other massively famous story about the goddess Nua creating humans out of clay? Why did ancient people need two completely different origin stories?
I mean, it comes down to the function of the myth. Mythologies are not neat, unified textbooks written by one author. They are incredibly messy compilations of different tribal beliefs.
Right, that makes sense.
Pangu is essentially a geological myth. It's an amalgamation of folk tales designed specifically to explain the physical universe, like where did the mountains come from, where did the sun come from.
Wow, okay.
But Nuwa represents something entirely different. She represents a much older, much more deeply rooted anxiety, the origin and survival of humanity itself.
So to really understand Nua and to figure out why she ends up looking like a strand of DNA, we have to strip away centuries of patriarchal revisionist history. We need to find the original version of Nua.
The untouched version.
Right. And when you look at the earliest archaeological and linguistic evidence, Nua version 1.0 didn't look like a snake at all.
Not even a little bit. Let's look at her core myth first. The classic story tells us Nua was walking along the banks of the Yellow River. She felt lonely, so she started handcrafting little figures out of the yellow mud.
Like sculpting clay.
Exactly. She meticulously sculpted these first humans one by one. And according to the later social hierarchies, these carefully crafted figures became the nobility.
But she got tired. I mean, hand sculpting takes a long time.
It takes forever. So she grabbed a vine, dipped it into the wet mud, and just started whipping it around. The splatters of mud hit the ground and instantly turned into countless commoners.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because you can look at Nua's mud whipping method as humanity's first conceptual assembly line.
Yeah, it really is.
But anthropologists see this as an encoded historical memory of a massive technological leap. The myth perfectly mirrors the Neolithic shift in human technology. Ancient societies moved from high-precision, handcrafted pottery, which took forever, to high-efficiency, mass-produced, wheel-made pottery.
That is the actual mechanism of the myth. The centrifugal force of a potter's wheel flinging off bits of wet clay is immortalized as a goddess whipping a muddy vine.
Wow.
The technological leap was so vital to their survival and expansion, they had to attribute it to a divine creator. But let's look at Nua herself. If we analyze ancient Chinese phonetics, we uncover a fascinating linguistic fossil.
Oh, the name translation.
Yes. The name Nua, specifically the Wa part, shared the exact same origin and pronunciation as the ancient word for frog.
So Nua literally meant frog.
Yes. Over centuries, due to natural phonetic shifts in the language, the throat sound W in Wa shifted to the lip sound M, giving us Ma. And Ma in almost every language means mother. So fundamentally, Nua translates to the ultimate mother frog.
A giant frog. Okay, I get the linguistic shift. But practically speaking, why a frog? Out of all the powerful animals in prehistoric China, bears, tigers, birds, why worship an amphibian?
It all comes down to the brutal reality of survival logic. Just think about the daily life of a prehistoric tribe. Infant mortality was staggeringly high. Humans were constantly at the mercy of the elements, predators, disease.
Right.
A tribe could be wiped out in a single winter if they didn't have enough people. The absolute paramount goal was population growth. Now, look at a frog.
Okay.
To an ancient gatherer, a frog's swollen belly looks exactly like a pregnant human womb. Furthermore, a single frog can lay thousands of eggs in a pond overnight. To a prehistoric human terrified of extinction, that is the ultimate superpower. It is geometric mass reproduction.
It's a primal survival mechanism elevated to the divine, and we actually have the archaeological receipts for this.
We do.
If you look at the Jiangxi site, which dates back 6,700 years, archaeologists unearthed these incredible pottery basins. They are intricately painted with images of pregnant frogs and thousands of little dots representing eggs.
Yeah, and when you find out what these basins were used for, it hits you right in the chest.
It's so sad. They were the lids for the burial urns of deceased infants.
It is a heartbreaking, desperate plea to the frog goddess. They are burying their children under the image of ultimate fertility, hoping for rebirth, or hoping the goddess will quickly bless the tribe with another child to replace the one they lost. It really highlights the sheer terror of prehistoric survival.
It paints a very vivid picture of prehistoric society, too.
Absolutely. In these early matriarchal societies, reproduction was entirely credited to the female. They didn't fully understand the biological role of the male in conception yet.
So it was parthenogenesis.
Yes, a belief in parthenogenesis. They believed that women brought forth life independently from their own bodies, just as women gathered the food from the earth to sustain the tribe. Therefore, the ultimate independent creator deity of life had to be a female frog.
That makes total sense for a prehistoric gatherer society, but it brings us to a massive contradiction.
Oh, a huge one.
If Nua was originally this fiercely independent giant frog creator goddess, how did she get completely rewritten? How did she end up as a snake-tailed woman permanently paired with a male god in that DNA-like painting?
That physical transformation is the direct result of ancient tribal warfare and the dawn of the patriarchy. As human society advanced in the Yellow River Basin, we saw the invention of deep plow agriculture.
Which changed absolutely everything about daily life.
Exactly. Deep plow agriculture required immense upper body strength to manage the heavy tools and the beasts of burden. At the same time as tribes accumulated surplus grain, tribal warfare became more frequent and brutally organized.
So the stakes got higher.
Much higher. Suddenly, male physical strength became the most valuable asset a tribe could have, both for farming and fighting. The social structure violently shifted. Men took control of the resources, and society moved from matriarchy to patriarchy.
And the mythology of the culture had to be actively rewritten to justify who is now in charge.
Precisely. During this time, the Huaxia tribe was rapidly rising to power. For context, the Huaxia are essentially the agrarian ancestors of the Han Chinese.
Okay.
Their tribal totem wasn't a frog, it was a snake, which eventually evolved into the symbol of the dragon. As the powerful Huaxia conquered the eastern and southern tribes, the ones who worshiped the frog goddess Nua, they forced a cultural assimilation.
But they couldn't just erase Nua, right? I mean, her worship was too popular and too deeply tied to childbirth.
No, erasing her would cause a revolt.
So they performed a literal totem overwrite. They kept the goddess, but they erased her frog legs, replacing them with a snake tail so she would match the patriarchal leader deity of the Huaxia, Fuxi.
And the linguistics back this up again. Fuxi's ancient name was Peloxi. If you trace that back to its phonetic root, bao or pao, it is the exact same root for ba, which means father.
Wow.
So you have the ultimate mother being conquered and forcibly paired with the ultimate father.
But the narrative gymnastics they used to force them together is just wild. To justify this new union to the masses, the patriarchal architects appropriated a bizarre flood myth from the Yao and Hishmong peoples.
Right, the southern mountain tribes.
Yeah, these were ethnic minority tribes residing primarily in the southern mountains, and as the Huaxia expanded, they absorbed their stories too.
The absorbed story goes like this. A thunder god escapes from a steel cage and unleashes a catastrophic flood that drowns the entire world. The only survivors are two children, a brother and a sister.
And they managed to float to safety inside a giant gourd.
Right, a giant gourd.
Huh.
Once the waters finally recede, they realize they are the last humans left. They have to repopulate the earth, but they are siblings.
So they asked the heavens for a sign. In one version, they roll 2 millstones down a mountain. If the stones land perfectly together at the bottom, they have divine permission to marry.
There's another version with smoke, too.
Yeah, in another version, they light fires on 2 different mountain peaks. If the smoke intertwines in the sky, the gods approve. The smoke mixes, they get married, and these 2 surviving siblings are retroactively branded by the mythmakers as Fuxi and Nua.
It's incredibly convenient.
But wait, this is where the logic completely falls apart for me.
How so?
Well, Fuxi is the god who supposedly brings civilization to humanity. He invents marriage laws specifically to separate humans from animals. But here he is, marrying his own sister. That completely breaks his own rules. How did the ancient scholars justify that without looking like massive hypocrites?
What's fascinating here is that to the architects of this myth, narrative logic or hypocrisy simply didn't matter.
It did.
No, this was purely a political merger. The patriarchy needed to domesticate Nua's wild, independent natural power into a rigid, male-dominated social structure. By making her Fuxi's sister and wife, they fundamentally demoted her. She no longer creates life out of the mud on her own. She now requires a male counterpart to reproduce.
Man, that is a brutal demotion. She goes from an independent creator to a subservient spouse.
And the ultimate insult to her origins, the original frog or the toad, was literally exiled to the moon.
The moon.
Yeah. As Chinese cosmology developed, the toad became the lunar, or yin female, counterpart to the sun. It was pushed entirely to the margins of the cosmos while the male dragon ruled the sky.
So Nua is successfully domesticated. And with this new paired image of Fuxi and Nua, the newly unified Chinese empires began to weaponize the mythology to establish absolute law and order.
Which brings us right back to the DNA image from the Turpan tombs.
Yes. By the time of the Han Dynasty, roughly 2,000 years ago, that specific image of Fuxi and Nua with their intertwined snake tails had exploded in popularity. It was carved into imperial tombs, painted on bricks. It was everywhere.
But there is a crucial detail in the artwork we haven't discussed yet.
The tools.
Exactly. In almost all these depictions, they are holding tools. Fuxi is holding a compass, a gi used for drawing perfect circles, and Nua is holding a square, a ju used for drawing perfect squares.
So what's the significance of that?
The tools are deeply symbolic. On a cosmic level, it visualizes the ancient Chinese cosmological view of round heaven and square earth. But more importantly, it broadcasts a core, unshakable imperial philosophy. Without the compass and square, circles and squares cannot be formed.
Meaning society requires strict rules, laws, and boundaries to function.
Exactly. It's the ancient equivalent of visualizing the state constitution. By holding these tools, they went from being primal gods of life and mud to becoming the ultimate bureaucrats of the cosmos.
Bureaucrats of the cosmos. I love that.
And this ideological imagery was incredibly powerful and far-reaching. Think back to the Astana tombs in Turpan that you mentioned at the start.
Right, Turpan is a high desert oasis along the Silk Road. It's incredibly far from the central plains of China.
Yet, centuries later, Han immigrants living in that harsh desert were still nailing these specific paintings to the ceilings of their tombs to watch over their dead. And what's truly remarkable about the Turpan paintings is that the faces of Fuxi and Nua often feature foreign hue facial characteristics.
Let's clarify that term. When you say hue facial characteristics, you mean the features of the non-Han nomadic peoples of the North and West, right?
Yeah.
People with deeper set eyes and higher bridges on their noses.
Yes. The artists were blending the foundational Han Chinese myth with the local ethnic features of the Silk Road. It proves just how widely this cultural order had spread and how effectively it adapted to absorb completely different populations into the empire's ideological framework.
It's a genius political maneuver when you think about it. By literally handing Nua a measuring tool, she transitioned completely from a wild, unpredictable mother goddess of nature into a foundational pillar of an orderly, predictable, male-dominated empire.
And this shift from being at the mercy of chaotic nature to actively controlling and ordering it dictates everything about Chinese mythology moving forward. You see it most clearly in how the culture handles the ultimate apocalypse, the Great Flood.
Okay, let's talk about that flood, because earlier we mentioned the Yao and Hamong myth, where a thunder god causes a flood, but mainstream Chinese mythology has a much more definitive, world-ending Great Flood event.
Yes, a massive one.
And the trigger for it is incredibly cinematic. There is an angry water god named Gong Gong. He gets furious after losing a cosmic battle, and in a fit of rage, he literally smashes his head into Buzu Mountain.
Which is a huge deal, cosmically speaking.
Right, because Buzu Mountain wasn't just a big rock. It was one of the physical pillars holding up the sky. When he snaps it, the sky tilts downward to the northwest, and the earth sinks to the southeast, causing the atmosphere to tear and all the celestial rivers to pour out, flooding the world.
It's a catastrophic structural failure of the universe itself. Now, if we compare this to the Western or Middle Eastern flood response, like the story of Noah's Ark, the contrast in human behavior is staggering.
Oh, completely different.
In the West, the flood is usually framed as divine punishment for human sin. God intentionally sends the water, and the human response is entirely passive. You build a boat, hide inside, and wait for the wrath to pass.
But the Chinese response is entirely human-centric and incredibly action-oriented. Nua doesn't build a boat to escape.
No, she doesn't.
She sets up a massive smelting operation. She melts down 5 colored stones, which represents the dawn of ancient metallurgy and the mastery of the 5 elements, to literally patch the physical hole in the sky. And to fix the broken pillar, she chops off the legs of a giant world-sized turtle to prop the heavens back up.
She doesn't flee the environment, she repairs the atmosphere itself. And that ethos doesn't stop with her. Later on in the mythology, you have the human hero Daiyu, or Yu the Great. He is tasked with managing the lingering floodwaters.
And he doesn't build an ark either.
Nope. He spends 13 years aggressively redirecting the rivers, digging channels, and building massive dams. He is so utterly focused on the physical labor of engineering the landscape that the myth says he passed his own home multiple times over those 13 years and never once stopped to go inside.
Wow. I have to ask, why is there such a massive psychological difference here? Why does the West flee in a boat, accepting the punishment, while China looks at a broken sky and decides to rebuild the atmosphere and re-engineer the rivers?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it all comes down to geographical roots and the mechanics of survival.
Yeah.
Western and Middle Eastern myths often originated in nomadic or maritime cultures.
Okay, right.
If you live by the sea and a massive storm hits, or if you are a desert nomad and a flash flood occurs, escaping in a boat or moving your tents to higher ground makes complete sense.
Yeah.
You flee the angry environment because your livelihood is mobile.
You can just pack up and leave. But early Chinese civilization couldn't do that.
Precisely. China's early mythology grew from an agrarian society that was absolutely bound to the soil of the Yellow River Basin. You cannot put a wheat field on a boat.
Right.
If the river floods, your entire civilization starves to death. Therefore, running away is not an option. You must govern the water. You must dig the trenches and build the dams. It highlights a deeply ingrained humanistic philosophy of man conquers nature, as opposed to a theology of divine punishment where man is helpless.
So what does this all mean for you listening to this today? It's easy to look at stories of frog gods, giant turtles, and sky-mending rocks as just ancient, quirky fairy tales. But consider how much of this ancient encoding still exists in the systems and behaviors around you.
We've traced an incredible journey today. We started with a womb-like frog goddess born out of prehistoric survival anxiety, a literal plea to survive infancy.
Right?
We watched her get conquered and physically transformed into a snake-tailed bureaucrat holding a square, all to serve the new rules of the patriarchy. And finally, we saw her elevated to a sky-mending hero for an agrarian civilization that absolutely refused to run from disaster.
And you know, the echoes of that original frog goddess are still vibrating in the culture today, even right now in some rural regions of China. When a baby turns 1 month old and survives that crucial early window, the family will dab 5-colored mud on the child's forehead as a blessing.
That is amazing.
It is a direct, living callback to Nua handcrafting humanity from the Yellow Earth. Even Mo Yan, the Nobel Prize-winning author, titled his profound, devastating novel about modern Chinese reproductive policies simply Frog. It's a direct subconscious callback to the ancient mother goddess of mass reproduction.
It really proves that these myths aren't just dead texts we analyze in museums. They are living, breathing reflections of how we organize our society, what we fear the most, and how we adapt to survive.
Which leaves us with a final thought to mull over. We are currently living in a brand new era, an age of artificial intelligence, of rapid genetic engineering, of expanding space exploration. Our environment and our tools are changing faster than ever before in human history.
That's for sure.
So as we build these massive new realities, what primal survival myths are we currently rewriting to justify today's new social orders? When future historians look back at us thousands of years from now, what double helix paintings will they find nailed to our ceilings?
A fascinating question to end on.
Until next time on The Deep Dive.